Welcome to the CCBO Capacity Building webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land we at CCBO live on and are proud to call home. The traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Métis Nation, Region Number 3, and all the people who make their home in the Treaty Region of Southern Alberta. We are all treaty people. This series is focused on topics that will help nonprofit professionals and the organizations they work with build their capacity and strengthen their impact. Thank you to our sponsors, Land Solutions and Altitude Communications, for their support of the CCBO webinar series. If you're watching this webinar live, we encourage you to post your questions in the question box, which you'll find on the right of your screen for the live Q&A portion and follow-up blog post. For this webinar on 5 things nonprofits can learn from startup culture, we're joined by David Yiptong of Platform Calgary. David has over a decade of experience in technology development, manufacturing, and telecommunications, and has been directly involved in creating several companies based on university research. He also provides early-stage entrepreneurs with coaching and mentoring, leveraging his technical and industry background to help them advance their opportunities. He has been awarded the Practice of Coaching badge by the Roy Group, an award for his leadership and use of tools in supporting others to amplify their performance, learning, and engagement. Platform Calgary is an innovation ecosystem and nonprofit startup incubator and accelerator. They are guided by their goal to generate shared prosperity in Calgary and build upon Calgary's potential to become a global innovation hub for startups and innovation. David's team at Platform Calgary works like a startup in all aspects of what they do, as they continuously integrate entrepreneurial strategies into their daily operations. Thank you for joining us, David.
All right. Thank you very much, Mary. Welcome, everyone. Again, today we're going to talk about 5 things that not-for-profits can learn from startup culture. I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll all be able to take away something from what the startup experience is like. As Mary mentioned in the introduction, I've been at the foundation of certain companies that have come from university technologies. I was part of the leadership team of a startup, and I could tell you that it's the kind of experience that can only be experienced. But there's a lot of learnings and there's a lot of philosophy behind what founders will do in a startup to move their organizations forward that are really applicable to any kind of organization. So hopefully by the end of this, I hope to sort of demystify a little bit of what a startup is for you, but also maybe shed some light on some of the practices that could actually benefit your organization as well. So, we're here, CCVO, right? Volunteer organizations, not-for-profits. How does startup, the biggest question is, how does startup culture even apply? So one of the things that, I want to emphasize for all of you is that startup culture, the way we know it today, actually evolved from manufacturing. So if you want to go way back in history, there was a gentleman by the name of William Deming that was the father of quality management processes. So all those things, those of you who've worked in industry who know ISO certifications, Six Sigma, Kaizen, all of those methodologies sort of stem from Deming's work, to the point where I believe there's a shrine dedicated to Deming in Japan. And part of that is that he was so influential with Toyota. So Toyota really brought this lean manufacturing methodology and applied it to their manufacturing processes. And that's really what led to their success. The operative word there is lean. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, because lean is really about learning. It's about taking small steps and making small improvements along the way. If you think about, a lot of times people will dismiss the opportunity to make a marginal improvement, an improvement of like 0.5%. But when you accumulate, a couple of hundred, of these improvements, you actually make substantial change. And lean was the philosophy behind lean was really about making incremental improvements and testing along the way so that you could learn and improve your processes and improve the way you do things. Believe it or not, prior to the tech crash in 2001, startups were actually pretty large organizations. They were very resource intensive. For those of you who remember, 2001 was the dawn of the internet. You had all these companies with websites that were getting lots of hits, but not delivering any value. And they were being funded in the millions and millions of dollars just to host a website. After the tech crash in 2001, there was a concerted effort to think about how to do this in a different way, in a more efficient way. And lean was really the methodology that was adopted in that time. Startups benefit from diversity and collisions. We think of startups today as being very, very tech heavy. When you look at the most successful companies that you see today, a lot of the innovation comes from when you have two different industries colliding together, or two different ways of doing things coming together. So startups really benefit from that diverse environment. So and that's something that benefits most organizations. When you think about having diversity of thought, input, perspective, that can help any organization. One of the criticisms, and we see this a lot in platform when we were working with startup entrepreneurs, especially in Calgary, when they come from large industry, especially the oil and gas industry, which is very, very capital intensive and requires a lot of planning and has a lot of regulatory requirements. The question from those entrepreneurs are, well, can I really use lean tactics in this industry? And the argument is yes. You can actually see pieces of the lean methodology in major things like aircraft design. The way films get produced is a good example. I always tell people, when a crew goes to gets together to start putting a film together, they don't start with principal photography. They don't start by filming scenes right away. They start by writing scripts. They do concept art. They will do some costume concepts. They'll even do table reads with their cast, and they'll iterate. It's easier to modify a script when all it is a story on paper. It's easier to edit that and make changes there at that stage than it is once you've started filming. So if you think about how that kind of project evolves, it is also a very lean process that way. So it's about iteration. It's about figuring out what works and doesn't work along the way. So as far as startups go, here's a list of characteristics that successful startups all have in spades. So if you take a look at this list, and things like startups have a vision, right? The thing about startups is startup founders is that they have an ambition to change the world. And the adage with startups is that you should want to change the world. You should not go out hoping to make lots of money. And the logic is, if you go out to change the world, if you're successful, not only will you have changed the world, but you will likely make money along the way. If you go out purely with the motivation to make money, you won't change the world, and because of that, you'll likely not make the money you were hoping to make. So vision is actually really important, and for startup entrepreneurs, having a broad, grand vision is key. But things like speed, being masters of budget, you can imagine most startups, don't make money for years. So they need to really maximize the assets and the resources that they have available to them. They need to be really good fundraisers, right? They need to be very diligent with their time management. They need to have discipline, determination, and execution, and an ability to execute when they have the opportunity. So if you look at all these characteristics, I'd like to ask you to think about your organizations, think about a not-for-profit organization, and think about whether these characteristics are actually needed in your situation. I think in a lot of ways, a startup and a not-for-profit are actually very similar in a lot of ways, because it's about vision. It's about a focus on a particular group, trying to affect change for a particular group of people. Obviously, you're fundraising. Obviously, you're all working with restricted time and resources. So you have to execute with you have to punch above your weight. You have to execute with the minimal resources that you have. Very, very similar to a startup. So that's why I kind of feel that there's a lot of commonality there, and there's stuff to be learned about how startups work today. So to help demystify what is a startup, um, this is a quote from Steve Blank. Steve Blank is a serial entrepreneur out of the U.S. He actually teaches his lean launchpad methodology out of Stanford, and so this is his definition. And we use this with all of our startup founders too, because it's something that is not really clear to most startup founders when they launch their company. And it's really that a startup is meant to be a temporary organization. A startup is not designed to remain as a startup. Hopefully, it hopes to graduate and become a large company, or become a going concern, a company. But while it's in startup stage, it's really built to search for a repeatable and scalable model. So a startup is really a team of explorers, if you want to think of it that way. It's designed to go and experiment. It's not designed to be a version of a large corporation that you put into the dryer and shrunk down to a smaller size. So with that, you need to think about what is a startup in real life. So one of the things you'll say is that Google is no longer a startup, right? Google is a publicly traded company. Facebook, publicly traded company. Twitter, no longer a startup. But if you look at a company like Google, they've maintained a lot of their startup culture within their company. So whether or not you know this, every year Google kills, dozens of projects. The most famous one that they ran into in recent years was Google Glass, right? Because that project went a lot further than it probably should have. But Google is constantly experimenting, is constantly exploring new areas of technology, and new areas of business, and then basically killing those projects. In contrast, typical large corporations that we're used to seeing are very, very good at executing existing models. So they're very good at creating the cookie cutter, right? And because of that, transitioning to new business models can be quite difficult for them, because they're not really flexible, right? So if you think about like an auto manufacturing company, when they tool up their assembly line, they need to basically produce cars on that line for 5 years to recoup the cost. They can't constantly be changing their models quickly, because there's just too much investment required. An example that's kind of recent today is, think about pharmaceutical companies. So you'll notice that Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine has been developed in partnership with BioNTech. If you go back about 15, 20 years, most of these pharmaceutical companies had massive, massive primary research facilities, doing work on things like vaccines, but on therapeutics and all kinds of things. But as a large corporation, they were really bad at managing that kind of exploratory work. So they got rid of them. They got rid of all of that stuff, and they rely on smaller companies and universities and academic institutions to basically create the primary research. And when it's ready to go into trials, that's when a large company like Pfizer will step in. So you see the same thing in the UK with AstraZeneca. Their COVID vaccine was developed at Oxford University, but AstraZeneca is the one taking it through the trials. AstraZeneca is the one that's ramping up production and distribution. Same thing with BioNTech and Pfizer. BioNTech was the sort of exploratory organization. Pfizer is a scaling organization, the one that's going to distribute. So for a lot of these large companies, it can be very, very difficult, or large organizations, or even organizations that have a long legacy of tradition. Transition can be very difficult. Some examples of companies that are successfully moving along an example would be like Corning, right? Corning, whether or not you know. Corning's the glass company. Some of you may remember that, Corning used to make dishware, right? Like, cookware. Um, Corning also makes glass. Corning went from making cookware to making laboratory glass, for your beakers and things like that. In the 70s and 80s, their biggest line of business was making glass for fiber optic cables for telecommunications. And today, Corning's biggest business is making glass for consumer electronics. So any of you that has a Samsung phone, an Apple phone, you've got Gorilla Glass on your phone, that's a Corning product. So now their biggest business, their biggest line of business is selling to these companies. So if you can imagine, over the years, Corning has had to really adapt because their customer has changed and the industry, the market that they're in has changed. Their core competency, their main strength is still glass, but they're selling glass to a completely different customer. Selling glass to Apple is very, very different than selling fiber optic cable to AT&T or to Bell Canada. And it's very different than selling Corningware and cookware and distributing it on a retail, into retail outlets. So they've made those transitions. An interesting one is Disney. You're seeing that happening right now live with Disney Plus. Disney is actually in the process of running experiments and redefining itself. So some of you may remember that back in September, Disney released the live action version of Mulan. They were trying to release it in theaters, but because of COVID, it kept getting delayed. So they finally decided, you know what, we're going to release this on Disney Plus and charge people $30 to see it. But if they wait till December, they'll get it for free as part of their Disney Plus subscription anyway. That was a giant experiment for them, trying to redefine how they release their work. So those are great examples. Some industries that have a hard time with these transitions that you're seeing right now are the audio industry, the retail industry, and financial services. And again, the reason why it can be difficult for some of these large organizations is that they're not temporary, and they're not designed for searching. They're not designed to do the experimentation. And then as we get through the 5 things that you can learn from startup culture, you'll see that experimentation and sort of agility is part of that. So first point, what's the first thing you can learn? Startups are very, very good at simplifying. If you can imagine, when you're a startup and you're trying to create something brand new, you often are in a situation where life is very ambiguous or very, very unclear. There's a lot of uncertainty. And how startup founders deal with this level of uncertainty is by simplifying the problem. So people often come to me and say that, entrepreneurship looks interesting, but I don't think I'm that much of a risk taker. And my response to them is always, good entrepreneurs are actually just really good risk mitigators. A good entrepreneur will sort of sit there and see 30 different risks to their company on the table. But a really good entrepreneur will look at those 30 and say, you know what? Risk number 7 and risk number 18 are the only ones I need to deal with today, or the only ones I need to deal with over the next 2 weeks, because they will take my company down immediately. Everything else, if I can live another day to attack those, great, but I don't need to worry about them right now. And simplicity, so that kind of focus and that kind of ability to sort of look at what's important, what's a clear and present threat today, really helps in dealing with uncertainty. Because risk number 30 or risk number 29, sure, that's there, but they don't need to worry about that. They hope to get to that point eventually, but they know that the problem that they're working on today are just the ones that they have to deal with, that keep the company alive. So simplification is a big thing. And I'll tell you this, my background is in engineering. So, when I work with people who have a technical background and we're looking to solve a problem, the tendency is to go and solve the problem from a technical perspective right away, to think about the end solution. A good entrepreneur doesn't bias themselves with the end solution and actually works on the problem from the perspective of the user, from first principles. And that, like I said, just simplifying the whole question and not worrying about how complicated or the regulatory problems we're going to run into or the budget issue right away. Let's just first think about what is the best way forward here. Simplifying helps clear their vision and deal with the uncertainty. So first thing you can do is definitely when tackling a problem, how can you chalk it up into something small that can be digested easily, that can be worked on? So simplification is a big thing. In software development, there's this methodology called agile, and what that means is instead of thinking of architecting this, a software package, you know, in one shot, right? Thinking about all the different modules and all the inputs and outputs, they're agile. They use what they call sprints. They're like, okay, well, we need to build something that does this. All right, well, can we get a team working on that? And in 1 week, let's see what they come back with. They may not be finished, but the idea is whatever they do get done will help inform the rest of the team about additional questions that got raised or problems or issues or other things that need to get solved. But the idea is that just keep it down to a week sprint so that you can at least have a checkpoint after 1 week and say, okay, we know what we're going to do next. So again, it just helps deal with the uncertainty because you can get mired down and bogged down by the enormity of the problem that you're trying to, of the product you're trying to build or the problem you're trying to solve. The next thing that startups do is they talk to customers. Now, in our programming, we use the word customer in a very generic way. Customers are basically anybody that have a stake in your in using your product or solution. They might be a stakeholder, they might be the recipient. So the example I give people all the time is that if I walk into a hospital, an emergency room, because I've got a broken wrist, I might get an x-ray taken. My input as a patient into how the x-ray machine works might be important for the designers, but I don't have a say at all into how the x-ray gets purchased or which x-ray machine gets purchased. The radiology technician that's taking my x-ray might have input into how the machine is designed, but they are not the buyer. Neither is the radiologist. And here in Alberta, when you think about AHS, there's a procurement group, there's an IT group, there's all these other people that are involved in that purchasing process. So if you think about all of those people, those are all quote unquote customers. They're all stakeholders in the adoption or use of the solution. So entrepreneurs are really good at talking and being in constant contact with their various user groups. And the reason for that is that these are the only real source of data. For those of you who've ever taken a business school class, you know that there's a lot of market research reports and things like that, and those can be valuable. Those can give you some insight. But if someone has written a report on it, then it's already known. In other words, it's an industry that has already been assessed. And for startups, where the real innovation happens is, like I mentioned before, is on the borders when two things are coming together, right? Where there's a chance for innovation or doing something different is where you're actually breaking the existing molds that are in use. So a market report that you'll get through your business school library or anything like that won't tell you the story. It won't give you the data you need to hear. You need to hear it from the actual users that you're trying to serve. And one of the other reason for that too is if you're truly doing something innovative, it's never really been done in that way before. So there's no playbook for it. And when you talk to people are really, really good at telling you what they don't like, but they'll only give you hints at what they actually need and what they do like. People love complaining, really. So with that, entrepreneurs have to be sort of really disciplined when they go out to make sure that they're asking the right questions and getting the right kind of information, knowing that people are going to be sort of biased in the way that they're responding, that they're going to respond. They'll be much more willing to complain about something, but then you have to really have them declare whether the problem is big enough for them to try to fix it. So entrepreneurs are always, when they're talking to their customers, they're always testing them. Two rules that we give to all entrepreneurs is when you talk to people, don't sell. Don't talk about your solution. Just ask the person you're talking to about their life, about their problem, how, and how do they deal with it. The other thing that's really useful as well is not to talk about the future. We tell entrepreneurs that when you're asking someone about the future, you're asking them for a guess, and they don't know the future any more than you do. So the key is to ask them about the present and the past. So you're not talking about your solution. You're asking your customer or the person you're talking to about their life, about the problem they have in their life, and what have they done today or yesterday to try to solve it, right? And that helps gives the entrepreneur some context as to what success and failure might look like, even though it's completely wide open and ambiguous. The other thing they do is they accelerate. And I talked a little bit about, software sprints earlier. Same idea here. Everything requires experimentation, and in this case, speed is far more important than accuracy. There's a saying in the startup community about low fidelity experiments as opposed to high fidelity experiments. So my experiment doesn't need to be pretty. My experiment just needs to give me some piece of information, something that I can act on. And the idea is that really good entrepreneurs, regardless of how big the project is, have chopped down their questions and experiments to be on a weekly frequency. And the reason for doing that is that when you're testing something over the span of a week, the cost of failure in that scenario is pretty low. The results come in faster and the failures are not catastrophic, right? So the idea is, and the more you test, the more data you get, you're actually able to make better decisions because you're accumulating information at a faster rate. So that's the thing. They accelerate their development, they experiment their tests, and they also experiment the projects that they kill. I mentioned Google before. They kill a lot of projects that we've never heard of because they've never made it outside of Google's campus, or they've only made it to a beta user group, and they haven't made it to mass market yet. And they just, the team decided this project was not worth maintaining. Because the data came back negative, and that's okay. They just went on and they move ahead. The next part, and I actually think this is probably the biggest cultural piece to startups, is having respect for failure. So we just talked about how startups are really about experimenting as quickly as possible, and experimenting quickly so that the cost of being wrong is pretty low. Here, I want to talk about how failure is not necessarily a negative thing, but it's a learning opportunity. And this is something that, when I get to work with students, we've done some work with engineering students, we've done some work with U of C and MRU students in the past couple of years. And I tell this to students all the time, that they spent their whole lives in school being told that there's a right answer and a wrong answer. The right answer gets them this grade, the wrong answer gets them this grade. But when you go to any sort of real life business situation, the answer to all questions is it depends. So the idea about respecting failure and actually looking for failure, because if you ask your customer a question and they answer yes, that's great. If they answer no, that's also a good answer. If someone was to ask me, David, do you want to buy a new phone right now? I might say yes, but I might say no. And a good entrepreneur will ask me in both situations, oh, you want to buy you're in the market for a new phone. Why? Why are you in the market for a new phone? The same way they're asking me and I say no, they should be asking me, no, well, why aren't you in the market for a new phone, right? understanding the reason for the person's telling you no is just as important as the reason for saying yes. So failure is not a bad thing. It's a learning opportunity. So there's a couple of quotes here from people who, who kind of really adopted that idea that failure is a learning process, is part of the learning process. Thomas Watson was a CEO of IBM in the middle of the 20th century there, when IBM became a global force. And he talks about, if you want to hit success faster, you have to increase your failure rate. There's another saying in the sports world, right? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So that's really, really important. And when we talk about culture, this is really a big piece, because most organizational structures are not, like I mentioned school before, most organizational structures are not designed to accommodate failure very well. Failure in the startup community is such a big thing. There's a gentleman who runs a museum in Sweden that is called the Museum of Failure. And he basically accumulates all of these products that have been absolute failures. He's got a couple of videos on YouTube that you can look at, and some of the stuff he has is hilarious, because so many large companies and brands had just had epic failures in product development. And for him, he's accumulating all this stuff because he's like, he keeps telling everybody, these are all learning experiences. These are all things that we should celebrate, because they were opportunities for their creators to say, wow, I got that really wrong. I had no idea, right? Perfect opportunity there. It goes into culture. So again, this is a major aspect of culture. I think as Canadians too, failure is not something that we're really good at accepting, especially, believe it or not, I think in contrast to some of our friends south of the border, they look at adversity and failure in a very, very different light than we do. So that's something that really benefits startups and founders, is their ability to process failures and how they turn them into opportunities. And from a cultural perspective, you need to have a team that's built around that. And we talk about team is super important in the startup, because the team, if you think about this acceptance of failure, or this acceptance of learning, you need to create an environment where the people on that team feel safe. And today is Bell Let's Talk Day. So we're talking about, if you think, and in our current news cycle, there have been examples of environments where people have not felt safe. And if you think about trying to build a culture where people are free to experiment, with granted, with the goals of the organization in mind, but are still willing to take chances and still willing to make small investments to see what comes back, that person needs to feel empowered to do that and empowered to make those decisions. So, the safety of a team can be really, really important. So in a startup, that team and the dynamic and how people work together is really, really super critical. So having a team with diverse skills and backgrounds is important. And Ray Yanamoto from made this comment at a South by Southwest years ago. Said, that the ideal startup dream team is a hipster, a hacker, and a hustler. And he has a breakdown, but basically the idea was take these three personas and cover all the bases of the work that a startup needs to do. Now you can imagine looking at the profile of a hipster, hacker, and hustler. These are people that would not normally socialize with each other, but having them together as a team makes them really, really, really good. Building a team is hard. If you can look at sports leagues, look at the NHL, look at the NFL, look at the NBA, Major League Baseball. These are professional team builders, right? The general managers of these teams are paid professionals to assemble the right team combinations. And think about how often they get it wrong. So in a startup environment, in a not-for-profit environment, this can be much tougher because you have far more resource constraints. But as leaders in these organizations, there's a lot that can be done to sort of create an environment where people feel okay with failure, with learning, and feel empowered to be making decisions. So team is super, super important. There's a startup. They're almost not a startup anymore. You may have heard of a company called Wealthsimple. They're a financial services company in Toronto. The founder of Wealthsimple is Canadian, Michael Katchen. He was part of another startup in the US called 1,000 Memories that they sold that startup to Ancestry.com. And then once he exited, he moved back to Canada. He had his idea for Wealthsimple. I remember him saying that one of his greatest triumphs was convincing all of his American co-founders of their previous company to move to Canada to work on Wealthsimple. Because usually it's the other way around, right? Canadians are moving to the US. But he was really proud of that. And it really showed how that team, with their past success, when they looked at each other, they realized, wow, we really work well together. So if we're going to try this again, why wouldn't we do it as a team again together? So that's a team that felt that had diverse inputs, but also felt safe enough to work with each other and to trust each other. Trust is super important. So those are the 5 major takeaways, but there's a bonus one too, which is up is the only direction you should be headed in. This graph here is kind of plotting the life of a startup, right? And in the beginning, it starts from on the left and it moves to the right. The TechCrunch of initiation. There's this huge sort of euphoria when people get started, and then what happens is, the honeymoon period is over, and then all of a sudden you're in this thing called the trough of sorrow. You could go online and hear Joe Gebbia from Airbnb talk about how they were living through the trough of sorrow. Your organization, when you're doing something new, when you have a new initiative that's being rolled out, you're going to go through these various troughs and valleys and things of that. But the idea is, a startup team, it always has their eye on the long game, their eye on the prize. They know that life is going to be challenging in the near term, but they have, again, you talk about that vision and that unwavering belief that, you know what, we can get there. We just have to figure out these things. So while they're in the trough of sorrow, while they're dealing with false hope, they're trying to run their experiments in very, very small increments and as quickly as possible to work their way out of that valley. It's even, in other contexts, that's been known as the valley of death for startups as well. So in a lot of ways, when I think of not-for-profits and I think of, you're trying to serve a very particular group of people, a constituency, you keep their well-being or whatever improvement you're trying to make in their lives first and foremost, and you just assemble a team that's very willing to deal with all of the challenges in the near term, and yeah, your trajectory should be upwards. So again, just to summarize, the idea around this is simplify as much as possible. The idea that the best way of simplifying is, what can you answer in 1 week? Sometimes I know that's hard, but whatever you do, if you can say, let's just do something where we can get an answer within 1 week, you'll see that it'll be a lot easier to deal with. And also you'll actually see measurable inputs, you'll see measurable data, you'll see measurable successes and failures that'll inform your next decision. Connecting with your customers or whoever your constituents are, or whoever the people you're serving are, the stakeholders, really key. Accelerate things though. It's all about getting stuff done fast. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be done quickly. And then the last two, like I said, are really, really deal with culture and team. Building a team where there's high trust, so that when challenges occur or when there's failure, you know what, it can be turned into a learning opportunity. The biggest note here, which is in the smallest font on this slide, is that you'll notice not one thing here referred to technology. So we were just, everything I've described to you up to this point was about tech startups, but none of the key aspects here actually deal with technology. Technology for tech startups is really just the enabler. These are the things that help startup founders create successful businesses. And with that, I'll open it up to some questions.
David, thank you. Okay, those are thought-provoking takeaways and insights, and we're ready to hear more. So we have a couple of questions to get us started off, and so I'm going to jump right into the Q&A. If you have a question for David, please submit it via the question box. If we don't get it to it today, David might consider it for his follow-up blog post. Okay, so for this first question, it speaks to the team that you talked about. So you talked about the importance of the team and the significance of an experimental mindset. Could you elaborate on the experimental mindset term and how that can be fostered in an organization?
Yeah, experimental mindset, you could look at it as experimental, which is exploratory, or you could look at it as problem solving, right? So if you think about, and to me, those are two sides of the same coin. If a willingness to solve problems or to tackle problems, or to, if there's a problem the team is facing, the willingness to say, okay, what is the smallest thing we can try just to see if we can make progress here? And that having that mindset, just the willingness to sort of think differently, to try different things, to look at things from a different angle, just so that the team is constantly moving. In a lot of ways, in a startup team, standing still is the worst thing that can happen. Because it means that they're not actually moving. You want to keep that momentum going. So experimental mindset can be either exploratory, just people looking into the distance and saying, well, how can I get there? Or it could be problem solving based. It could be looking at your current situation and saying, how do I improve this? The worst answer is like, well, we've always done it this way, right? An experimental mindset is like, no, that's not a good answer. Why do we do it this way? And that goes back to the Toyota lean manufacturing too. Anybody on the assembly line, it didn't matter who they were, had the authority to shut the assembly line down if they saw there was a problem that needed fixing. And it wasn't about, well, in the American manufacturing and Canadian manufacturing environment, it would always be the QC guys, the quality control guys will pick this up. We'll let them fix it later. Toyota said, no, we fix it at the source, but we need to know where the source is. So if you find the source, you have to be willing to push the button and shut the thing down. So it's that problem-solving mindset and that exploratory mindset at the same time.
Okay, thank you. For this next question, this has to do with scaling and revenue. So with a startup, at some point, you get to a place where you have a cash flow from customers. Nonprofits that are scaling for users might not be getting an increase in revenue. How might this affect how they move out of a startup model or phase?
Yeah. Now, whether the question there is whether or not you need to move out of a startup model, right? So the example we were talking about with Google as an example, they've already moved out of the startup model, so they have to do things at scale. They have to file, they have to file their SEC regulatory filings. They have to, they have to pay employees. Like, they're a large company now. But what they've maintained as a kernel in terms of their culture for product development, for experimentation, is integrated within that large group. So in a lot of ways, if you think about the 5 things we talked about today, it's not about transforming a not-for-profit into a startup, but it's more about how does an organization in a not-for-profit context adopt some of the traits of a startup to help it move, to help it become more efficient, to help it serve its user base more effectively, help it actually report to its funders, help it show its funders that it's got more efficacy, or it's got more efficiency in how it uses its dollars, right? That's really the piece of it, because you're right. in a funding model where, you know what, you're still beholden onto your funders, that's going to be something where that relationship needs to be nurtured. But just like a startup, that's a relationship that needs to be worked on, right? They're a partner. How can you show to them that you're taking their dollars and actually making better use of it, or redirecting them into areas that are even more effective because you've taken on that kind of experimental mentality uh, and startup mentality.
Okay, great. For this next question, how might you suggest the startup model be adapted to other sectors, such as arts and culture?
I was just having this conversation with someone yesterday, and for one thing, I will say this: for the startup and innovation community, I actually believe that arts and culture are essential for a city like Calgary to have a vibrant startup community. Um, there's a company out of Montreal called Lightspeed. They do a lot of point of sales terminals for small business based on Apple's products. They're a huge company. They just became publicly traded last year, and the founder of that company is from Vancouver. And they asked him why he settled in Montreal, and his answer was Montreal had the right combination of technology and creative. And so, for one thing, I think both need to exist um, for Calgary startup and innovation community. The next part to your question about how does an arts community look at adopt startup methodology, things can be very traditional. If you're performing art, right, your world has been rocked by COVID, right, because theaters are closed. Everything has gone online all of a sudden, right? Okay, that's a problem. So how do you deal with that? If you think about what a startup will do, they'll start going to talk to their customers. They'll go and talk to their season ticket holders and say, okay, well, you haven't been able to, you've been season ticket holders for 2 years now, or 2 or 3 years, but you haven't been able to see a show or a concert in person in the past 12 months. What have you done? Right? Asking them, what have you done? Asking them, what did you like about it? What did you not like about it? And as you start asking those questions, talking to your customer and listening, the idea there might be a collision there or an opportunity there for something different. And that's where the innovation will come out. So I think that's where a lot of arts organizations can start looking at that, especially ones that have been disrupted by COVID right now. You had a user base prior to COVID. You had fans or loyal followers prior to COVID. What have you done to reach out to them during COVID, and not necessarily reaching out to them and sort of offering them product, like offering them concerts or things like that, but asking them, how many YouTube concerts have you gone to? How many have you signed up for? What was your experience like? Getting them to tell you what they like and not and what they like and what they didn't like will actually help inform you as to what the next iteration needs to look like. And that would be an arts organization using startup methodology to figure out their way out of COVID, as an example. Yeah, so I hope that helps.
Thanks, David. So this next question deals with kind of measurement. How might you measure the impact of experimentation and failure to a funder that requires impact measurements, such as governments and foundations?
Yeah, and that's a problem that we face as well at Platform, and it's one of those things where it's it's not all or nothing. Your whole organization does not go into experimentation mode, right? Um, Part of your organization still needs to be keeping the lights on, right, and keeping the core business or the core activities going. We have that same problem with Platform because there's a lot of experimentation we have to do, but there's still programming and there's still initiatives that we need to sustain within the community or with our entrepreneurs. So our entire organization is not actually working in a full-time way on experimentation. I can tell you the team that I'm on, the advisor and programs team at Platform. all of us do some sustaining work, what I'll call sustaining work, which is where we're delivering current programming, we're working with entrepreneurs, we're working with our partners. But then there's the experimental work as well, which is we're doing outreach, we're figuring out new things, we're building new partnerships, we're trying to experiment with new programming. But there's always a bit of a split between how much experimentation you're doing versus how much main work you're doing. Because I think someone had mentioned to me before that they were very weary of taking on an experimental mindset in a not-for-profit because their funders wouldn't want to be paying for this. Well, and I think the idea is that they shouldn't be paying for all of it, but if you're delivering a certain base value that you're constantly delivering as of today, how do you get part of your team to say, hey, you know what, for 1 day a week or 5 days a month, how do we go and actually look at improving something? For the next 4 weeks, how do we just improve on this one aspect? And the more you start adopting that mindset, that's how you're bringing on the experimentation while still delivering the core business that you're doing right now. And hopefully the learnings will help influence how to change even the core business down the road.
Great, thanks for unpacking that. So for this next question, do you have recommendations for tools and strategies nonprofits could use in this acceleration phase, this experiment phase, which you mentioned was all about exploring and experimenting efficiently?
Yes. One of the hardest things, and it's funny, we have a platform, we have a course that's called Discover, and it's 4 sessions. And it's around something that we called customer discovery. And in the lean startup methodology, you'll see that customer discovery is really one of the very first stages. We started delivering this back in 2016. And when we put it together, we basically said our goal is to never have to deliver this again, because it should be in the water, it should be in the air. Like people should know that this is how you do it. But here we are, 2011, we're still delivering it, and it's still very, very relevant. And Discover is all about those 2 things I mentioned when you're talking to someone and you're exploring with your market, is not to talk about the solution. Don't jump to a solution right away. Don't talk about the product you're trying to build or a service you're trying to build, and not to ask questions about the future. And if you and your team can really ingrain that methodology into your brains, so that when you go out and you speak to the people that you're trying to help, even speaking to your funders, and you stick to those rules, but you're using it to gather information, you'd be surprised how much information you can get. And that is that tool, that skill set is literally the basis for everything. I could tell you when I started, in startups and exploring markets and things like that, it was tough to wrap my head around the idea about not talking about what I was trying to build. And also verbally reminding myself not to use the future tense and to rewrite my sentence in a past or present tense. But once you get past that, you'd be surprised how much information you can get from people. And I also tell all our participants in our Discover program, when you've become a master at doing customer discovery, the people you're talking to won't know it's happening. So, when I'm standing at the checkout line of the grocery store, I'm always making conversation and asking them questions, just to see, and they'll tell me stuff. And it's not classified information, but it's not stuff that I would be able to find on an internet search either. So, yeah, in terms of tools, just that mindset of customer discovery, like not trying to sell anything up front, not worrying about the solution right away, but really and focusing your questions on the present and the past is hugely, hugely valuable. And that I would recommend that as the first step. Yeah, as the first step to get started. You can look up online, if you look up customer discovery and look up lean startup, there's tons of videos. Startup Calgary has a one evening session called Customer 101 that talks about that. Platform has got a 4-session customer discovery program that gets you trained into that. But honestly, that whoever you talk to, there's been books written on this. It's the most useful thing to get started with.
Great, thanks, David. We have time for one more question. And so this is just to build on this, talking to customers a little bit more. And you already gave us an example of, how it's used in the arts and culture, and really great resources that we can look at. But can you give us another example of how a startup effectively communicated and actually connected with its customer to understand their wants and needs? So, how did they communicate? How often? What platforms, what means, what language, tone, that kind of led to their success in communicating and connecting?
So first of all, good entrepreneurs will always communicate with their customers or stakeholders, or whatever you want to call them, directly, not through some sort of method, like, not necessarily through a website or an email or a survey. Because when we run our customer discovery program, we joke that inevitably someone in our class gets yelled at by someone they're trying to talk to. Because and what they end up finding, in one case, we found out that some other company had gone and poisoned the market already, because this entrepreneur was just calling this gym owner, to ask for an interview, and this gym owner started yelling at him. She was like, "Why do you guys keep calling me with these pyramid schemes?" And he's like, "What did I say to this person?" Right? So first of all, direct communication, and in this COVID time, it's going to have to be by Zoom, right? But direct communication is far more valuable. You get richer data, you get their body language, you get inflection. You can also let the conversation go. You can let the customer guide the conversation. You can let them tell you what really bothers them and let them dig into it. So that's one thing. In terms of like an example of a company that's done that, there was an engineer from the oil and gas sector who came into one of our programs, and he said he didn't want to go back, but he saw that in engineering they did there was a lot of reinventing of the wheel, right? There's a lot of the same engineering drawings or designs that they would use constantly. So he goes, there's got to be a way that these companies can share this and give credit to each other, and just be more efficient overall, because he saw there was a lot of waste. As he was doing his customer discovery, he realized really quickly that engineering firms didn't care about the waste, because they were billing their customer anyway. It was just a billable hour for them. But as he was doing his exploration, where he found the most traction, someone kept saying, "Do you know who needs this? Small municipalities need this." And he changed his direction completely based on that. He started exploring the small municipality space, and he found a huge amount of traction. The problem was, he was an engineer from the oil and gas sector. He didn't know the municipal market at all. He didn't understand how they were structured. He didn't understand their language. He didn't understand, there were terms and acronyms that he had no idea. So he had to just immerse himself into that market. And there was one summer, he used to drive a truck. He used to drive a Ford F-150. He parked that Ford F-150 and he bought a Ford Focus, like used, I think for $6,000, he told me, because that his truck was too hard on gas. And he was basically traveling to all of these small communities, meeting with members of municipal council, of city hall in those small communities, and trying to learn about how they speak and the problems they have. But that's his business now. He's got like 10, I think he's got 10 to 20 employees now. He's expanded to the US. He's received investment. But it was that pivot. It was a major pivot, not the market he intended, but he found someone that valued what he was trying to do.
Thank you. Thank you for that example. And thank you, David, for sharing your expertise with us. I look forward to reading your follow-up blog post, which you'll all be receiving in a follow-up email, and you can also find on our website at calgarycvo.org. You can get in touch with David via email and follow Platform Calgary on social media. Feel free to check our webinars from the rest of the series on our website, as well as information about events like Nonprofits at 2 and details on how to become a CCVO member, so you can attend events like Nonprofits at 2 for free. And thank you again to our sponsors, Land Solutions and Altitude Communications, to the CCBO team who worked behind the scenes to produce this webinar, and to you, the audience, for spending this time with us. We hope you can join us again soon. Thank you.